There is a single frame from a doorbell camera in the Catalina Foothills north of Tucson. The timestamp on the device reads 1:47 in the morning. In the next frame, the device is dark, not powered down in the way a homeowner powers down a camera, not switched off from inside the house. Dark the way something goes dark when a gloved hand reaches up in the last second before disappearing and decides the camera will not be watching anymore. 25 minutes later, a second camera inside that same home registers what its software describes as a person. There is no recording. There is no footage. There is only a single electronic entry that confirms movement. 17 minutes after that, at 2:2008 in the morning, a pacemaker application installed on an 84-year-old woman's telephone loses its connection to the phone. It has been tethered to every hour of every day for months. The woman who wears the pacemaker is no longer near the telephone. By sunrise, she is no longer near the house. By noon, the friend who is expecting her for a Sunday morning virtual church service is standing at the front door calling a name nobody will answer. And by the following week, the entire country will be staring at the porch where a figure in a mask once stood with a stillness no investigator can fully explain. This is not a case about a woman who wandered away. This is not a case about a family quarrel, or a confused memory, or a mistake by someone elderly in the dark. This is a case about a person who arrived at a specific door, at a specific hour, with a specific backpack and a specific weapon, and a plan that began to unfold the moment the camera went dark. 78 days into the investigation, the person on the porch has not been named. The woman inside the house has not been found, and the questions the evidence keeps raising are louder now than they were on the first morning. Welcome back to True Crime Investigator Alex. Before we go any further, if you want to stay with this case as it continues to move, hit the subscribe button and tap the bell so every new development lands where you can see it. Like this video if you believe Nancy Guthrie deserves more eyes on her story than the headlines have given her. Now let us go back to the beginning of the night the world changed for one family in Arizona. Nancy Ellen Long was born on the 27th of January in 1942 in the town of Fort Wright, Kentucky. By the early 1970s, she had moved with her family to the southern Arizona desert to a city pressed against the base of the Catalina Mountains, to a house that would become the anchor of a life built over the next 5 decades. She married a man named Charles Guthrie. Together they raised 3 children. A daughter named Savannah, who would one day sit in the anchor chair of a national morning television program watched by millions. A daughter named Annie, who would become a poet. A son named Cameron, who would serve as a colonel in the military before his retirement. For a long time in Tucson, Nancy Guthrie was simply a mother and a wife. A woman who kept a quiet home in a quiet neighborhood. Then in 1988, on a mining exploration trip in Mexico, Charles Guthrie died. He was 49 years old. Nancy was 46. She was suddenly a widow with 3 children and a house in a city on the edge of a desert. She did what she had been doing her whole life. She kept going. She raised her family. She held the home together. She went to church on Sundays without fail. She had dinner with her children and grandchildren at standing appointments on standing nights of the week. For 38 more years after the death of her husband, she lived in the same corner of Tucson, in the Catalina Foothills, in a quiet, unincorporated community where the houses sit on large lots and the nights are dark, and the coyotes cross the roads at dusk. She was known in her neighborhood. She was known at her church. She was known by the people who serviced her house, who delivered to her door, who saw her twice a week or once a month, or every time the seasons changed and a new repair became necessary on the property. By 2026, Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. Her heart was not what it had been. She wore a pacemaker. She took medication every day to manage her blood pressure and her cardiac condition. Her mobility was limited. Sheriff Chris Nanos of the Pima County Sheriff's Department would later tell the public that she could not walk 50 yards on her own, but her mind was sharp. Her routines were intact. Her Sundays were consistent, and her home, with its front porch facing the quiet street and its back doors opening toward the hillside, was the center of a life she had built piece by piece across more than 5 decades. The last fully ordinary evening of Nancy Guthrie's life was Saturday, the 31st of January, 2006. She had dinner with her daughter Annie and Annie's husband Tommaso. It was the kind of family dinner she had attended hundreds of times before. A meal together, conversation at the table, the warmth of a house full of people who loved her. When the evening ended, her family drove her home. They pulled into the driveway of the house she had lived in for decades. The time was approximately 9:45 in the evening. She walked to her front door. She went inside. She was 84 years old. She had her medications. She had her telephone with the pacemaker application connected to it. She had her routines. She had her plans for the following morning. A virtual church service she was going to watch at a friend's house at the usual Sunday hour. She closed the door. Her family drove away. Nobody who loves her would see her again. We do not know what Nancy Guthrie did in the hours that followed. We do not know whether she sat in her living room, whether she read, whether she watched television, whether she spoke to anyone on the telephone, whether she prepared for bed in the usual way, whether she changed into the pajamas she would later be said to be wearing when she was taken. We know only that time passed. The sky darkened further. The street outside her house went quiet. Her neighbors turned off their porch lights. The Catalina Foothills slipped into the particular silence that belongs to the desert at night. A silence that is not empty, because the desert is never empty, but a silence that carries a long way. Somewhere in that silence, a person was moving toward her door. That person may have been moving for hours, may have been moving for days, may have been moving toward that door since long before that Saturday night, planning an approach that had already been rehearsed in the mind of whoever was doing the planning. We do not know when the suspect arrived on the street where Nancy lived. We do not know whether the person arrived on foot, in a vehicle, alone, with others. What we know is what happened when the person reached the porch. At 1:47 in the morning on Sunday, the 1st of February, the Google Nest doorbell camera mounted on Nancy Guthrie's front door was disconnected. The moment was captured in the data the camera's cloud infrastructure retained even without an active recording subscription. The device did not malfunction. It did not run out of power. It did not experience an internet outage affecting the entire neighborhood. It was disconnected. At 2:12 in the morning, 25 minutes later, another camera system installed at the property registered the presence of a person inside its field of detection. Because the household subscription plan did not preserve video from this interior device, no footage exists from this moment. There is only the electronic entry. A person was there. At 2:2008 in the morning, 16 minutes after that, the pacemaker application on Nancy Guthrie's telephone disconnected from her phone. This is the piece of data that has haunted this investigation more than almost any other piece. The pacemaker app disconnects when the phone is no longer within range of the pacemaker. The phone stayed in the house. Nancy did not. In 41 minutes between 1:47 in the morning and 2:28 in the morning, a person entered the Catalina Foothills, reached her home, disabled the camera that faced the street, moved through or around the house with enough proximity to trigger a second camera's detection system, and left the property with an 84-year-old woman who was no longer anywhere near her own telephone. 41 minutes. That is the window. Every piece of evidence the public has been allowed to see has come from inside that window, or from what was left behind when the window closed. When the sun rose on Sunday, the 1st of February, the world did not yet know anything had happened. The neighborhood was quiet. The house looked from the street the way it had always looked. Nancy did not arrive that morning at the home of the friend with whom she had planned to watch her Sunday virtual church service. The friend waited. The friend called. There was no answer. Around noon, a report was made. A welfare check was requested. The Pima County Sheriff's Department began arriving at a property in the Catalina Foothills. What they found is still being held back in the public narrative of this case more than it is being released, but the early details were enough. The front door situation that did not match a normal morning. The back doors found propped open, which Savannah Guthrie herself would later describe in her interview with Hoda Kotb, saying that when the family first understood what they were looking at, They thought perhaps Nancy had suffered a medical episode in the night, and paramedics had come, because the back doors were propped, and that did not make any sense. And it did not make sense until it made a different kind of sense, one that was worse than the sense they had first tried to make of it. Nancy's medication was in the house. Her telephone was in the house. Her walker was in the house. Her shoes were in the house. Nancy was not. On the front porch, investigators recovered a small quantity of blood. The blood would later be tested and confirmed by DNA analysis to belong to Nancy Guthrie. Inside the home, additional blood was found. A law enforcement source told CBS News at the time, described as dried and located near a doorway. The Catalina Foothills home was now a crime scene. Sheriff Nanos told reporters in his earliest press conferences that he believed Nancy Guthrie had been taken from her home against her will. He said she did not leave on her own. He said she could not have left on her own. He said the home she lived in was being treated as the site of a crime. In the first days, the family was quiet, and then the family was not. Savannah Guthrie, by then one of the most recognizable faces on American morning television, stepped away from her broadcasting responsibilities. Her siblings joined her. Together, they began posting videos. In the first of those videos, the three of them stood together and made an appeal to anyone watching. They asked for information. They asked for help. They asked the public to look again at anything strange they might have seen in the neighborhood, at any camera footage they might have from the night before, at any moment they might have noticed and dismissed. Cameron Guthrie, the retired military colonel, spoke directly to whoever might be holding his mother. He said the family had not heard anything. He said the family needed a way to communicate. He said they needed proof that their mother was still alive. The public watched him say it. The public waited. Nothing came. Then, a few days later, the family released another video, and this one was different, in a way that generated immediate speculation across every platform where this case was being followed. Savannah, flanked by her siblings, said these words: "We received your message, and we understand. We beg you now to return our mother to us so that we can celebrate with her. This is the only way we will have peace. This is very valuable to us, and we will pay." A message had been received. Someone had spoken, and the family was telling whoever had spoken that they had heard, and they were ready. At the same moment, the investigators working the case were trying to determine whether the messages the family had received, or the messages news organizations had received, were actually from the person or people responsible. They did not know. And they still, as of the day this video was made, have not told the public whether they ever came to know with certainty. The first ransom note reached a local television station in Tucson before it reached the family at all. On the 2nd of February, 24 hours after Nancy had been reported missing, the CBS affiliate Cold News 13 in Tucson received an email. The email demanded payment in Bitcoin. The amount requested, according to reporting from TMZ, which received what appeared to be the same note roughly 12 hours later, was in the millions of dollars. The note included a legitimate Bitcoin wallet address. It included 2 deadlines. The first deadline was set for 5 o'clock in the afternoon local time on Thursday, the 5th of February. The second deadline was set for Monday, the 9th of February. The note, according to multiple journalists who reviewed it and discussed its contents publicly, contained wording that suggested the writer was familiar with the Tucson area. It included, according to the journalists at TMZ and Cold who handled it, details about items inside Nancy Guthrie's home that had not been released to the public. Details that, if the note was genuine, could only have come from someone who had been inside. Charles Latibaudiere, a CO executive producer at TMZ, told News Nation that the note included a description of an Apple Watch that had been damaged in the home. He told the audience that the wording of the note, the structure of it, the references inside it, suggested to the team that reviewed it that the person who wrote it knew Tucson, knew the geography, knew where Nancy lived in relation to other places. The note specified that Nancy would be returned to Tucson within a particular time frame, which Latibaudiere declined to disclose on air, but which he said provided investigators with a usable radius for where she might be held. The note was taken seriously by the FBI and the Sheriff's Department. The deadlines were taken seriously. The Guthrie family asked for proof of life. The deadlines passed. The proof never came. The Bitcoin wallet, as of the date TMZ later reported, showed some activity for the first time after the deadlines had elapsed, though TMZ's Harvey Levin declined to specify the amount that had moved through the wallet, saying only that there were reasons he was not going to say more at that time. Then more notes arrived. A second note, received by TMZ the following week. This one was structured differently. This sender claimed not to be the person who took Nancy Guthrie, but to have information about who did. The price for the information was 1 Bitcoin, roughly 66,000 American dollars at the time. The Bitcoin address was different from the address in the first note. The sender claimed to have tried to reach Cameron Guthrie by email and text and to have been unsuccessful. The note was forwarded to the FBI. Its authenticity has never been publicly confirmed. Weeks later, yet another note reached TMZ, this one claiming to have seen Nancy alive in the Mexican state of Sonora, a state whose northern border runs along the southern edge of Arizona, approximately 70 miles from the house in the Catalina Foothills where she disappeared. Authorities stated they had found no evidence Nancy had crossed the border. The note was one more layer in a growing pile of communications, each demanding something, each promising something, each containing just enough detail to make it impossible to dismiss and not enough to confirm. And there was at least one documented case in which a person did try to exploit the disappearance for profit. A man in Southern California was charged in federal court with making a fake ransom demand by text message on the 4th of February, attempting, according to prosecutors, to extract money from the family by impersonating someone with knowledge of the crime. He had no such knowledge. He was charged. He was separate from the investigation into the actual disappearance. But his case is a reminder of what happens when a disappearance becomes a national story. The predators who follow in the wake of the predator who struck first. On the 10th of February, 9 days after Nancy Guthrie had last been seen, the most significant public break in the case occurred. The Federal Bureau of Investigation, working with private sector technology partners, announced that they had recovered footage from the Nest doorbell camera that had been disconnected at 1:47 in the morning on the 1st of February. The footage had been considered lost. The household had not subscribed to the Nest recording service that would have saved video automatically. When the camera was disabled, whatever it had recorded should have disappeared into nothing. But a forensic analysis of what technicians called residual data located in back-end systems produced images that the FBI, through Director Kash Patel, released publicly. Images that showed a figure on the porch of Nancy Guthrie's home in the pre-dawn hours of the 1st of February. The figure wore a ski mask that covered the face, but left the eyes visible through cutouts in the fabric. The figure wore gloves. The figure wore a dark jacket and light-colored pants. On the figure's back was a black backpack that investigators later identified by brand and model. An Ozark Trail Hiker Pack, 2,005 liters in capacity. The backpack is sold exclusively through Walmart, either at brick-and-mortar stores or online, and Sheriff Nanos would later describe it in an interview as one of the most promising leads in the case. Walmart, the sheriff said, had provided the investigation with records of all Ozark Trail hiker purchases across several months. Investigators were reviewing surveillance footage from Walmart locations, looking for a person who had bought that backpack in that window of time. At the figure's hip, visible in one of the images, was a holstered firearm. On the figure's face, the mask. On the figure's body, the deliberate loose-fitting clothing that revealed almost nothing about build or age or identifying marks. The FBI's forensic analysis estimated the figure's height at approximately 5 feet, 9 inches to 5 feet, 10 inches. The figure's build was described as average. In one of the video clips released, the figure approaches the camera, raises a gloved hand, and covers the lens before turning back. In another clip, the figure faces the camera, holds a flashlight in the mouth to free both hands, and places vegetation from the yard in front of the lens, a second layer of concealment on top of the first. The tampering is methodical. The movements are unhurried. The approach is, in a word that analysts and commentators have used repeatedly since the footage became public, comfortable. That word carries weight in this case. A person approaching a stranger's front door in the middle of the night with the intent to commit a crime of this magnitude would, in the view of forensic behavioral researchers, almost certainly display some visible sign of the physiological stress the body produces in such situations. Heart rate elevates, breathing shifts, movement patterns change, micro-hesitations appear. Even through a mask, a trained eye can identify the body language of a person under acute stress. The figure on Nancy Guthrie's porch does not display these signs. The figure moves across the porch the way a person moves through a space they have seen before. That characteristic, more than any other visible in the footage, has led the most careful voices commenting on this case to a specific conclusion. The person on that porch was not arriving at an address they had never seen. The person was not improvising. The person was executing. This is a crucial distinction, and it leads to a further question, which is whether the figure on the porch was acting alone. The evidence, when it is laid out in the order it was collected, suggests strongly that the answer is no. Consider what had to happen for this crime to proceed as it did. Someone had to know the house. Someone had to know Nancy's schedule, her routines, her mobility limits, her physical condition. Someone had to know where the cameras were placed. Someone had to know whether the household had a subscription that would preserve footage, because the approach to the front camera was careful in a way that suggested the intruder did not know the footage would not be saved, or did know, and chose to disable the device anyway as a matter of method. Someone had to know the layout of the home well enough that a back door could be propped open as part of an operational plan, rather than discovered in confusion. The back doors, as Savannah Guthrie told Hoda Kotb, were found propped open when the family arrived, not forced, not broken, propped, actively held open. A person improvising alone in a house they had never seen before in the dark, in the middle of the night, does not prop a rear door. A person executing a plan that had already been mapped out by somebody who knew the house does. The forensic researcher Dr. Gary Brucato, a visiting scholar at Boston College who co-created the Columbia Mass Murder Database during his tenure at the Columbia University Irving Medical Center, and the New York State Psychiatric Institute, offered an analysis of this case on the Brian Enton Investigates podcast that has become one of the most referenced expert readings of the publicly available evidence. Dr. Brucato drew a distinction that is as useful as it is chilling. He described the figure on the porch as, in his framing, the waiter, the instrument, the person carrying out the visible part of the crime, and he suggested that behind the waiter there must exist another figure, the chef, the person who designed the operation, the person who chose the target, the person who knew the house, the person who no camera caught, the person who never stood on the porch at all, because that was not the role this person was assigned in the plan. Dr. Brucato emphasized that this was his professional inference based on behavioral analysis and on statistical frameworks developed across decades of peer-reviewed work on offender profiling. He was not naming any individual. He was not accusing anyone. He was saying that the pattern of evidence, taken together, strongly suggested more than one person had been involved in the planning and execution of what happened to Nancy Guthrie on the 1st of February. There is a statistic that underlies the forensic reading of this case, and it is the starting point from which every disciplined analysis begins. Between 76 and 92% of female homicide victims in the United States, according to various strands of the published academic literature, knew their killer in some way, not always intimately, not always as a friend or a family member, but in some way, a face that had been seen before, a name that had been heard, a connection, however indirect, that predated the crime. Statistics describe populations, not individual cases, and nothing about this statistic proves anything specific about Nancy Guthrie's situation. But it is the starting number. It is the probabilistic base rate from which any investigation into the harm or disappearance of a woman in this country must reason. And when it is placed alongside the observable behavior of the figure on the porch, the stillness, the calm, the absence of visible stress, the knowledge of the layout that is implied by the propped back doors, it points in a specific direction. Whoever is responsible for this, in the view Dr. Brucato expressed on the podcast, probably had some prior form of connection to Nancy. Not necessarily close, not necessarily a friendship. The connection could be what the researcher described as a passing one: a contractor, a landscaper, a delivery driver, a maintenance worker, a service provider of any kind who had at some point acquired, in the course of legitimate access to the property, a mental map of the home and its rhythms, or a person in a space Nancy visited regularly: her church, a restaurant she liked, a medical facility she visited, or a person connected through someone else who had access. A one-sided relationship, as the analysis noted, in which the person responsible knew far more about Nancy than she knew about them. Here is the hard implication, and it is the reason this analysis matters for anyone watching this video who may live in Tucson or may have passed through Tucson in the months before the 1st of February. Somewhere in the world this investigation is moving through, a person holds information about who did this. That person may not know they hold it. The information may be a memory of a conversation that seemed unremarkable at the time, a question asked at an ordinary moment about Nancy's schedule, a person who expressed unusual interest in her property, a comment made in a context that would not, at the moment it was made, have triggered any alarm. The tip line set up by the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI's national line at 1-800-CALL-FBI are not only for people who witnessed something directly. They are for people who remember something that has begun to look different in retrospect. That is how this kind of case is often broken. If you are still with me, and I hope you are, because the picture of this case only comes into focus when every piece is examined together, do me a small favor. Hit the like button. It is a free way to tell the platform this case deserves to reach more people. And if you have not subscribed to True Crime Investigator Alex, subscribe now. We are following this case every step of the way. When new information breaks, this channel will break it down for you. Now we have to talk about what the investigators have been doing and what they have found that has not yet produced a name. The Pima County Sheriff's Department, led by Sheriff Chris Nanos, opened the investigation in the first hours after Nancy Guthrie was reported missing. By the second day, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had joined the case. United States Customs and Border Protection was contacted because the home in the Catalina Foothills sits approximately 70 miles from the southern border of Arizona, and any investigation into an abduction in this region must account for the possibility that the victim or the offender or both may have crossed into Mexico. Search and rescue teams were deployed. Canine units were brought in. The neighborhood around Nancy's home was canvassed door to door. Surveillance footage from homes along the likely routes of approach and departure was collected and reviewed. Nearby gas stations were visited by investigators looking for any vehicle on camera that might match a suspicious profile from the early morning hours of the 1st of February. The FBI deployed a device known as a signal sniffer, a tool designed to detect electronic signals that might be emitted by a person being held in an unexpected location. The investigation has also deployed genealogical DNA analysis. This is the same methodology that produced the identification of Joseph James DeAngelo as the Golden State Killer, decades after his crimes. When conventional DNA databases had failed to produce a hit, and investigators turned instead to public genealogical databases to trace family trees outward from a sample. The glove found near Nancy Guthrie's home, the one the FBI had early attention on, was sent for genealogical analysis. Its DNA, initial testing indicated, belonged to an unknown male. It was later reported that the DNA on that specific glove was traced to a local restaurant worker, whom the Pima County Sheriff's Office said was not considered part of the investigation. Other DNA evidence was being analyzed separately. Investigators also recovered approximately 16 gloves from the area around Nancy's home. Most of those, the FBI stated, belonged to searchers who had discarded them while working the scene and the surrounding terrain. Mixed DNA was reported from inside the home itself. Genetic material from more than one contributor recovered from the same location. Mixed DNA requires a more sophisticated analytical process to separate and profile. That process is ongoing. On the 10th of February, investigators announced they had detained a person in Rio Rico, Arizona, a community approximately 12 miles from the Mexican border, south of Tucson. The person, who identified himself to reporters as Carlos, had been identified through a series of electronic investigative tools including cell phone usage and traffic data, according to sources who spoke to ABC News. A local judge in Santa Cruz County signed a warrant. Carlos's home was searched overnight. He was questioned for several hours. He was released without charge. He is under no law enforcement restrictions. Sheriff Nanos subsequently clarified that Carlos had been cleared. The investigation moved on. In the weeks that followed, federal prosecutors from the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Arizona visited the home in the Catalina Foothills, accompanied by FBI special agents. Timothy Corchain, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Arizona, told reporters his office would go anywhere, do anything, and persevere always to find her. Sheriff Nanos confirmed that the entire Guthrie family, including Savannah, Annie, Cameron, and their spouses, had been cleared as possible suspects. The FBI moved its command post from Tucson to Phoenix, citing operational efficiency for a long-term investigation, since most of the agents working the case were based in Phoenix. A sheriff's deputy was stationed outside Nancy Guthrie's home around the clock for security purposes, because the property had become a destination, with people leaving flowers and handwritten signs and yellow ribbons. At the entrance to the driveway, and with vloggers and amateur journalists arriving at the street, which would eventually prompt increased patrols around the home of Annie Guthrie and her husband Tommaso Cioni as well. A makeshift memorial grew outside the property. A yellow ribbon, the symbol of hope for the missing, began appearing on posts and porches across Tucson and beyond. One of the details that has raised the most difficult questions in this investigation is the discovery, reported by Fox News Digital, and later acknowledged in part by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, that one of the doorbell images released by the FBI appears to have been captured on a different date than the others. The department stated that it had never released timestamps on the Nest video itself, that any suggestion the photographs were taken on different days was, in the department's initial wording, purely speculative, but it also acknowledged that the images released earlier in the investigation depicted the suspect in different stages of attire, including with and without a backpack. Experts who had studied the images had raised exactly this question, noting differences in the clothing and the presence or absence of the backpack and firearm. If the reporting is correct, and if one of the images was taken on a prior date, then the figure who entered Nancy Guthrie's porch on the 1st of February had been there before, had approached the door before, had, in the view of several analysts, scouted the property in advance of the abduction. A scouting visit would mean that the plan was older than the night itself, that somebody was watching Nancy's home for longer than anyone realized, that the approach to the porch at 1:47 in the morning on the 1st of February was not the first approach. It was the final one. The Pima County Sheriff's Department asked residents in the Catalina Foothills to review their own home security footage, not only for the night of the 31st of January and the early morning of the 1st of February, but also for the entire month of January, and in particular for the late evening of the 11th of January. That request, made publicly, is as close to an admission as the investigation has offered that something significant may have happened at or near the property on that earlier date. When Savannah Guthrie finally sat down with her former CO host Hoda Kotb for her first full interview since her mother's disappearance, the interview aired on Today in 3 parts on the 26th and 27th of March. She spoke about the morning the family arrived at the house. She described the back doors propped open. She said the family had first thought, in their confusion, that Nancy must have had a medical episode in the night and paramedics must have come, because that was a reason doors might be propped. But it had not made sense. And then slowly, Terribly. It had begun to make a different kind of sense. She said her mother had been taken in her pajamas, without her shoes, without her medication, without the routine items that her daily life depended on. She spoke about the fear that her mother had been targeted because of Savannah's own public identity. She said, in words that took the air out of the room, "It is too much to bear to think that I brought this to her bedside, that it is because of me." And then she said, "I am so sorry, Mommy. I am so sorry." It was a statement of a kind the public rarely hears from a figure of Savannah Guthrie's visibility. It was personal. It was painful. It was the sound of a daughter speaking directly into a camera to a mother who might or might not be able to hear her. In the same period, the family raised the reward. The FBI had announced its first $50,000. The figure had been raised to $100,000. On the 24th of February, Savannah announced the family's own offer of $1 million. The combined reward between the family's offer and the federal contribution now stood at approximately $1.2 million for information leading to Nancy's safe return or to the arrest and conviction of anyone involved in her disappearance. Sources close to the family told ABC News the family had been prepared to fund the reward from the start, but had waited on the advice of investigators. That advice, presumably, had been given in the belief that the early communications might lead directly to a recovery. They had not. On the 6th of April, Savannah Guthrie returned to the anchor desk at Today for the first time since her mother's disappearance. She walked onto the set to a crowd of fans outside the studio wearing yellow ribbons. She thanked them. She told viewers it was good to be home. She told the audience, "Here we go, ready or not. Let us do the news." Producers had, according to reporting, implemented strict procedures for how any breaking news in the investigation would be handled while Savannah was on air, including sequestering her from the set if a major development broke during the broadcast, and having another anchor handle the story. On the day of her return, TMZ revealed that it had received 2 additional notes, described by the outlet's founder Harvey Levin as coming from the same sender as the original February note demanding millions in Bitcoin. The new notes requested half a Bitcoin in exchange for information about where Nancy's body was and who the kidnapper was. A second message said the sender had seen Nancy alive with her captors in the state of Sonora, Mexico. TMZ forwarded the notes to the FBI. No public confirmation of their authenticity has ever been issued. Authorities have stated, there is no evidence Nancy crossed into Mexico. 74 days into the investigation, the forensic and clinical psychologist, Dr. Gary Brucato, appeared on the Brian Entin Investigates podcast and offered the most structured public analysis this case has received. What Dr. Brucato presented was not an accusation. It was not a claim about any specific individual. It was a professional framework grounded in peer-reviewed literature on offender behavior and applied to the visible evidence, from which he drew inferences that the investigation could use as prioritization guides. He spoke about the base rate, the 76 to 92%. He spoke about the behavioral signature visible in the doorbell footage, the calm, the absence of the stress response that a person committing such a crime in an unfamiliar environment would ordinarily display. He described that behavioral profile as consistent with what the clinical literature calls a psychopathic character structure, a term that in forensic psychology has a specific technical meaning. It refers to a person whose emotional architecture is organized fundamentally differently from the statistical norm, a person who does not experience the fear, the guilt, the anticipatory distress that in most people functions as a biological break. Dr. Brucato was careful to distinguish clinical diagnosis from behavioral inference from footage. He was not diagnosing anyone. He was applying a behavioral framework to a visible data point and drawing a probability assessment. The probability assessment leads to a further inference. A person with this character structure, according to the published literature, almost certainly has a history of prior antisocial or criminal behavior, not necessarily violent abduction. The extreme end of a behavioral spectrum almost never appears without prior expressions lower down the spectrum, which would mean that the person or people responsible for what happened to Nancy Guthrie are probably not unknown to any system. They have probably come to the attention of law enforcement before. They have probably left marks in databases, in institutional records, in the memories of neighbors and former employers and former acquaintances. The genealogical DNA methodology being applied to the glove recovered from the scene may ultimately produce an identification. The mixed DNA inside the home may, once the profiles are separated, produce another. And the combination of forensic evidence and behavioral inference may narrow the frame for investigators in a way that allows a tip from the community to become the piece of information that closes it. The chef, in Dr. Brucato's framing, does not wear a mask. The chef appears in ordinary contexts. The chef is the reason this investigation has not yet found a name, and the reason it may still find one. Dr. Brucato went further into what the evidence suggests about what may have happened inside that house during the 41 minutes between 1:47 in the morning and 2:28 in the morning. He presented two scenarios as the most statistically probable interpretations, and he emphasized throughout that he was offering inference, not findings, and that no conclusions about Nancy's fate had been confirmed by law enforcement. The first scenario is that the abduction was designed from the start to look like a ransom situation, but the actual intent was not financial. The ransom notes, the Bitcoin demands, the deadlines, the apparent willingness to negotiate were misdirection. They bought time. They created a false investigative narrative that would consume resources before it could be fully tested. The goal in this scenario was not a payment. It was something else, achieved or attempted under cover of the appearance of a kidnapping. The second scenario is that the kidnapping was genuine. The intent was financial. The operation was designed to take Nancy, hold her, and leverage her family's resources and Savannah's public profile into a payment. But the plan encountered a variable it had not adequately accounted for: Nancy herself. She was 84 years old. She was dependent on daily medication for her heart. She wore a pacemaker. She had been taken in her pajamas, without her shoes, and without her medicine. The medical variables alone created conditions that an operation built around the assumption of a compliant, transportable hostage could not reliably predict. What happens to a pacemaker-dependent person under acute physiological stress in the middle of the night? What happens when the medication she requires daily is absent from the first hours forward? The answer is that things that were not part of the plan begin to happen. And in that second scenario, as Detective Brian Martin, a cold case specialist with the Fort Wayne Police Department in Indiana, articulated separately on the same podcast, the kidnappers may have underestimated Nancy Guthrie's health. A medical event, a period of stress the plan had not built redundancy for, may have meant that Nancy was no longer of value to an operation built on holding a living hostage for payment. When a person is no longer of value to a financial operation, in the grim language of these cases, the calculation of what to do next changes. Dr. Ann Burgess, the forensic nurse and researcher whose foundational work with the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in the late 1970s helped establish the discipline of criminal profiling as it is practiced today, spoke about the case in her own episode on the same podcast. She addressed the blood evidence directly. She asked the question that 78 days of investigation have not publicly answered. She asked where the blood goes. She said, in the plainest words the case has yet produced, she just vanishes. Savannah Guthrie has continued to speak. The family has continued to post. The reward has remained at $1.2 million. The FBI has continued to work through tens of thousands of tips. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has received thousands of calls on its dedicated tip line. As of the most recent updates before this video was made, no individual has been named as a suspect. No arrest has been made in connection with the disappearance. The investigation is described by law enforcement as active and ongoing. The Sheriff's Department has stated that the investigation will continue until Nancy Guthrie is located, or all leads are exhausted. The family, in a statement released after weeks of silence, asked the Tucson community to search their memories. They asked people to consult their cameras, their journal notes, their text messages, any conversation that in retrospect might carry meaning. They asked specifically about the key timelines of the 31st of January and the early morning of the 1st of February, and also about the late evening of the 11th of January, a date that points back to the possibility that the figure on the porch had been there before. Savannah, in the Today interview with Hoda Kotb, framed it the way a sister and a daughter would. She said, "Someone knows something, even if that something is, someone has been acting strange for the last 7 or 8 weeks. Even if it is just that, someone knows. Maybe somebody is afraid." She said she understood that. "But," she said, "our hearts are in agony. We cannot breathe. We cannot live. Consider what we actually have. 78 days on. We have a woman, 84 years old, mother of 3, grandmother, widow for 38 years, a fixture of a Tucson neighborhood for more than 5 decades, a churchgoer, a family anchor, a person whose daily life followed rhythms so consistent they could be charted from the outside by anyone paying attention. We have a home in the Catalina Foothills where she lived alone, with mobility too limited to walk 50 yards without assistance, with daily medication her heart depended on, with a pacemaker that required constant electronic monitoring through an application installed on the telephone she kept near her bed. We have a specific time window, 1:47 in the morning on the 1st of February, when the doorbell camera facing the street was disconnected by a gloved hand, 2:12 in the morning, when a second camera's software registered the presence of a person inside the home's field of detection, but produced no video because no subscription was active. 2008 in the morning, when the pacemaker application on Nancy's telephone lost its connection to the phone, indicating the phone was no longer within range, which means the pacemaker was no longer within range, which means Nancy was no longer within range, which means in the 41 minutes between 1:47 and 2:28, she had been removed from the house. We have the back doors of the home found, propped open, not forced, not broken, propped, held deliberately in place as an operational element of a plan. We have blood on the porch, confirmed by DNA analysis to be Nancy's. We have a small additional quantity of blood reported from inside the home near a doorway, noted by a law enforcement source as dried when discovered. We have the figure on the porch, the mask with eye cutouts, the gloves, the dark jacket, and light-colored pants. The 25-liter Ozark Trail Hiker Pack backpack, sold exclusively through Walmart. The holstered firearm. The height estimated at approximately 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches. The build described as average. The movements described across the board as calm, comfortable, unhurried. We have the tampering with the camera. First a gloved hand, then a flashlight held in the mouth, then vegetation placed in front of the lens, a methodical concealment. We have the possibility, reported by Fox News Digital and partly acknowledged by the Pima County Sheriff's Department, that one of the images released shows the suspect on a different day, indicating a prior scouting visit to the property. We have approximately 16 gloves found in the area of the home, most belonging to searchers, and one specific glove whose DNA was initially pursued, and whose DNA profile was eventually traced to a local restaurant worker whom the sheriff's office said is not considered part of the investigation. We have mixed DNA from inside the home, still undergoing analysis, along with the decision by investigators to pursue the genealogical DNA pathway that was used to identify the Golden State Killer decades after his crimes. We have ransom notes, a first note demanding millions in Bitcoin, with 2 deadlines, the 5th of February and the 9th of February, both of which passed without payment or proof of life. A second note demanding a smaller amount in exchange for information about the kidnapper. A third note claiming the sender had seen Nancy alive in Sonora, Mexico. Activity in a Bitcoin wallet after the first deadlines had passed. Details in the original notes, according to the journalists who handled them, that suggested familiarity with Tucson and referenced items inside Nancy's home, such as an Apple Watch, reportedly damaged in the incident. A separate federal charge against a man in Southern California who attempted to extract money from the family with a fake ransom demand unrelated to the actual crime. We have the detention and release of a man in Rio Rico, identified publicly only as Carlos, whose property was searched and who was cleared. We have the cleared status of the entire Guthrie family. We have the move of the FBI command post from Tucson to Phoenix. We have visits to the home by federal prosecutors and FBI special agents. We have the border with Mexico 70 miles south, and authorities stating they have found no evidence Nancy crossed it. We have the statistical framework applied by forensic researchers, the 76 to 92% base rate, the behavioral analysis of the figure on the porch, the inference that the person or persons responsible almost certainly had some prior connection to Nancy, however indirect, and almost certainly have a prior history of antisocial or criminal behavior, and almost certainly did not act alone. We have a family in Tucson and New York, and everywhere Savannah Guthrie's voice reaches every morning holding a hope that is, in Savannah's own words, blowing on the embers. We have a reward of $1.2 million. We have tens of thousands of tips. We have 78 days, and we have no name. Nancy Guthrie is still missing, as this video is being made. Her condition and her whereabouts remain unknown, according to the most recent public statement from the Pima County Sheriff's Department. The investigation is active. Leads are being followed. Forensic work continues. The glove has been sent for genealogical analysis. The mixed DNA inside the home is still being processed. Behavioral analyses from researchers outside the investigation are being offered and considered. The community is being asked to search its memory, and across all of it, the family waits. The daughter who returned to her anchor chair on the 6th of April waits. The brother who spoke directly into a camera on the 5th of February asking for proof of life waits. The sister who stood beside them both waits. The friend who called the house that Sunday morning and got no answer waits. The people of Tucson, in a community that has now in the family's words become family, wait. And somewhere, almost certainly, in a home, a workplace, a conversation that seemed ordinary at the time, a person holds a piece of this that they do not yet recognize as the piece that could end it. If you have watched this far, thank you. This case is one of the most unusual in recent American memory because of how much is known about the final minutes Nancy Guthrie spent in her home, and how little is known about what came next. If you believe Nancy's story deserves to keep reaching people until this case is closed, share this video. Send it to someone who follows true crime. Send it to someone in Arizona. Send it to someone whose work has brought them into contact with contractors, service providers, community networks in the Tucson area over the past several months. And if you have any information, no matter how small it seems, no matter how unconnected it may feel, call the FBI at 1-800-CALL-FBI or reach the Pima County Sheriff's Department dedicated tip line. The reward stands at approximately $1.2 million. 10% of leads, according to the chief of detectives for the Pima County Attorney's Office who spoke publicly about the work, have actual value. It takes one. Subscribe to True Crime Investigator Alex to follow every development in this case as it continues to unfold. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the moment this breaks. We will be here. We will follow it. We will tell you what the evidence says and what the researchers see and what the community remembers. And we will keep telling it until Nancy Guthrie has been found and the people responsible have been named. Nancy Ellen Long Guthrie was born in 1942. She raised 3 children. She lived in one city for more than 5 decades. She sat at family dinners. She went to church. She kept her telephone by the bed. She closed her front door on the night of the 31st of January at approximately 9:45 in the evening. And at 1:47 in the morning, the doorbell went dark. Somebody knows what happened next. Maybe you do. Until next time, keep watching, keep asking questions, and stay with this case.